John Mitchener if he would ask God's blessing on our meeting. And I'll ask David Swafford if he would lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. So if everybody could please stand. John, go ahead.
Our Father in heaven, we ask that the things that we do today and every day, that they're not in vain, and that somehow you take our heart and our motivation and you accept what we do as a sacrifice pleasing to you, and that in spite of ourselves that you work good out of it. Protect us as we work for freedom, protect what's left of our nation, and help us to defend it and to recognize that this nation is really only a subset of your kingdom, and that's where our real citizenship is, and that if we represent you, the rest can take care of itself through your Holy Spirit. Thanks for this food. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Salute, pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to read a note I got from one of the candidates that appeared here. And I think you'll find this interesting because it comes from Corey Brooks. And if you remember, the day that we voted to determine which candidates we would support, we had a very lively discussion about Mr. Brooks. And as it turns out, our members, by I think a 3-vote margin, did decide to support Corey Brooks. So it was a very controversial vote. When I went by the post office, or went to the post office on Thursday to put the checks in the mail to all the candidates that we had supported, I checked their box and I had this note from Corey. So it does not influence, it didn't influence our vote at all. Dear Mr. Meadows, again, thank you for the opportunity to have lunch with you and the OPAC team. I enjoyed my time with you all. I know we didn't quite agree on everything, but it is always good to have one's views challenged and be forced to periodically review what you believe and why. Now, folks, that's a powerful statement. That's really a good statement. And that's a statement with a purpose. I mean, anybody that really believes that, I think is not so dogmatic that they're not actually willing to think about issues and allow information presented to them to challenge them. He goes on to say, I appreciate all of my parting gifts, and those parting gifts were a number of DVDs and things like that that I gave to him, and look forward to reading and understanding them. Regardless of how next week's vote goes, I hope we can all stay in touch. It's great to see such dedicated voters meeting together with such regularity. Again, thank you for the lively lunch. Onward to victory, Corey Brooks. And I thought I wanted to share that with you. We get thank yous quite a bit of times, and usually I'll just post them on the board at the end of the election cycle, and you can go up and read them. But this is one I actually wanted you to see and hear. Any announcements today or anything before we get on with our meeting today? And I will mention that I have a few new items on the table here, one of which was the Communist Manifesto, but I see they're gone already. Some of you commie lovers.
Trying to start a new club.
You know, the John Birch Society, there's some people actually believe it's a communist organization, because at their bookstores they sell the Communist Manifesto. Not that they're promoting the idea, but they think it's important that you thoroughly familiarize yourself with your enemies. And you do that oftentimes by looking at what your enemy actually stands for out of his own words. And so anyway, that's the reason for that. I can get more. I only brought 2. They're gone today. So Monday night I was due to speak, or I actually was in Ada to speak about the State Chamber of Commerce. And of course, when I put in my email that I would be talking about couple of the Looney Tune positions that OK Safe was taking, and that's the term that I used. I figured Amanda would show up, and she did. And so I never got to talk about State Chamber of Commerce. We actually had a debate on 3 different of the state questions. And one of the ones was actually on the state question regarding affirmative action. OK Safe has taken a position against that. And so following Ward's presentation, and Diane, what is your last name, please? Okay, Shackerly, who also had some input on that. Amanda and I got up front and we went after it there, I think as objectively as possible, and it was an interesting time, I believe. What was pretty amazing was a pretty good level of expertise among the audience that night. And the audience came out with several positions that really put Amanda, I think, in a weakened position, and I don't think Amanda did well that night. Something that I want all of you to understand in your activism, you need to do your very best. I never want you to compromise your principles, but you need to do your very best to make sure you don't marginalize yourself. Believe me, there's nothing more than our enemies, whether they're liberals or whether the establishment of the Republican Party, there's nothing more that they would love to do than to marginalize conservatives. And so one of those ways that you avoid being marginalized is pick your battles. And this state question is going to pass, I predict, with 65 to 70% of the vote in the state of Oklahoma. And all of our conservative lawmakers supported this. All of our conservative lawmakers have supported the 2 property tax reforms. So when you're taking a position in opposition to that, you run the risk of really marginalizing yourself. When you pick your battles, sometimes, it's just not worth getting involved in, unless you want to destroy yourself. And there's been plenty of attempts to marginalize OPAC for many years. And I've told people it's like walking across a stream on the back of alligators. And that's really what it's a little bit like, because we have people shooting at us from every direction. But our consistency and other things such as that, I think, have kept OPAC above the fray or out of that position of being marginalized. That doesn't mean that there aren't people, particularly the state capitol, hate us. They hate the accountability part. They love the money we give them and the fact we'll go knock doors for them, but they hate being held accountable. Can you imagine such a novel idea as telling people that you're a conservative and you believe in limited government when they want your vote and your money, and then they go and they vote like a liberal Democrat? I believe those people deserve to be held accountable, whether they have an R by their name or anything else. And so that's what we do. And when you do that, you're going to put a target on your back. But anyway, I'm really happy today. I've actually been aware of Mr. Connerly for a number of years now, more from a peripheral position. But I knew that in California he was the lead person in an effort to eliminate preference hiring and admission practices in the state of California, and promoted a statewide initiative, which I guess maybe amended the Constitution of the state of California to do that. He had a good friend, his name was Pete Wilson, and Pete was the governor, and asked him to serve on the State Board of Regents. And he did that for several years. He'll tell that story, I'm sure, here in a minute. But he's a very accomplished individual. He's authored at least 2 books, if I understand correctly, and I don't know if you had any of those with you or not. I wish you did, because I'd love to have one or both of them. But anyway, we're very fortunate to have a high profile. I've heard him on talk radio a number of times through the years, and we're very fortunate to have a high profile national figure like this, who's as accomplished as he is and has done as much. So please welcome Ward Connerly from Sacramento, California.
Charlie, dear friend, thank you very much. It's great to be with you. I was at the event that he referenced on Monday night, I guess it was. And it was like being in a different planet as I heard the explanation of why this initiative 759 is a bad one. And Charlie set the record straight. You would have been proud of him. Let me talk to you a little bit about affirmative action, as it is called, and why I believe that its time has come to pass into the sunset. And I've noticed that whenever I mention to someone that I think that 759 ought to be passed and what we loosely call affirmative action ought to be ended, I get glazed eyes, or some will say, well, that's interesting. First of all, people are surprised that a brown-skinned guy would be supporting the end of something that people presume to be of benefit to those like me. And my life has been one in which I have seen all of the nuances of affirmative action and why it is not what it is professed to be. And thankfully it is not in some respects. But race touches all of us, whether we know it or not. And if at first blush you believe that this doesn't affect me, we all pay a race tax. And that's a tax based on the fact that our society doesn't maximize the capabilities of all of its citizens. When you think about classifying people, first of all, into these, what I call these food groups, black, white, Latino, Native American, Asian, that's the first problem. Government shouldn't be asking us to pick some race to which we belong so that they can then distribute dollars and other things. That's the first problem. That's the first tax that we pay. But if you look at the schools, a disproportionate number of, quote, minorities, a term that I hate, a disproportionate number of minorities are languishing at the bottom, costing tax dollars, but not producing the benefits that we, the taxpayers, expect from our educational systems. If you look at the jails and prisons, a disproportionate number of those that are incarcerated are black and Latino, costing us as taxpayers more than individual citizens should. The common denominator of all of this is that people are not leading productive lives and are a drain on society rather than a contributing member of society. Joe Biden, at the Democrat convention, made the comment that America is not in decline. I disagree with that. I think our nation is in decline. And if I were to use my own life as a benchmark and look at things as they were when I entered this planet and as they are today, I can personally attest from my own perspective that things are not as good as they were then. American life has declined. And our failure to recognize that impedes our ability to correct what is wrong and to make it better. Back in 1939, when I was born, even in the darkest hour of the relations between quote, black people and American life, there was a sense of right and wrong. There was a sense that this is not the way that it ought to be in the Deep South, Louisiana. And Martin Luther King even talked about America living out the true meaning of its creed. There was an understanding of what the Constitution commanded of all of us. He talked about, if I'm wrong about this, and he was talking about the principle of equal treatment under the law, then the Constitution is wrong. So I have grown to believe over the years that we need to fundamentally transform, not in the sense that Barack Obama would have us do, but we need to transform American life so that we get back to basics. We appreciate the Constitution and we live by the Constitution. We appreciate God's command that we're all equals and we be treated as equals. And that means that if you screw up, you're treated that way, but you don't get any preferences because of things like skin color or other attributes of race. If we're going to transform American life, what are some of the building blocks that we need to put in place? We need the principle of merit. Everybody, and I mean everybody, should be expected to carry their full load. Nobody should be presumed to be getting a free ride for any reason. Now, that isn't to say that we're not going to help those who are standing by the wayside and really need help. Yeah, we're going to do that because we are good and decent people. But I don't think that we enter this whole rebuilding process with the notion that we really are our brother's keeper. I think that that thought enters after we have exhausted the principle of merit and made sure people understand that there's a responsibility that you have to get up in the morning, work hard, produce, give something back to your society in the form of your production. Having exhausted all of that and you can't make it, then our Christian ethic will cause us to step in and help to the extent that we can. But still, in my view, the burden of carrying your own weight and producing is still on your shoulders.
Amen.
That's how we make the country better. That's how we make sure that everybody is rowing in that boat as best they can. Now, this means that you don't get admitted to college with any extra points. You don't get a contract set aside for you based on skin color or gender or ethnic background or anything like that. You don't get hired based on those factors. Not only is that not the last ditch effort in our country, it is the first in many cases. You enter the competition with the presumption that if you are of a certain, quote, race or ethnic background or gender, you get these points. You get that leg up. Now, if you put that in place and you institutionalize that, what do you think that the result is going to be after a few years? People begin to expect it. And that's where we are now. We have a society in which there are too many people who are not productive, costing the rest of us, who are expecting a free ride. And every day it grows and grows and grows. I was born in circumstances in which my father had left the house when I was 2. I didn't see him or hear from him in 58 years. That was probably a blessing, considering the kind of man that he was. My mother died when I was 4. But I had the benefit of a grandmother, a maternal grandmother, and an uncle and an aunt, an uncle by marriage, who had very basic values. Uncle James was as conservative as they come. He loved to hunt. Anything that moved around, Uncle James had a bead on it. But the values were very basic. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He saw a nickel on the street, look around to see if somebody dropped it. If they did, hey, you dropped that. Never take anything that doesn't belong to you. Look out for your family. You don't impregnate girls or women unless you're married. And if you do, you better get married to that person. Values were basic. Love your country. Take care of your yard. Take care of your car. Make sure it's washed. Make sure your shoes are shined. Go to church on Sunday. Not that he was that religious, but he felt that church had a way of civilizing people, making them recognize that they're part of something other than themselves, that there's something in life to which we need to look at. It's a good Lord. But very basic values. You may not agree with all of them, but they provided structure. They provided a roadmap for younger people to follow and to know that there's some lines on the road there, and you need to stay between those lines in order to fulfill the promise of being a good citizen. In the fullness of time, I have seen those lines wear away. They're not there anymore in many cases. And our society has become unraveled because there are no white lines on the road there. We stray all over the road. So what I have tried to do, starting with my term, I say my sentence on the Board of Regents, a 12-year unpaid sentence, was to try to bring back some order within my own sphere of influence to my society. I urge my colleagues to get rid of any preferential treatment in the admissions process, the contracting process, and the hiring process of the University of California, which was then a $9 billion operation, and succeeded. And then I asked the people of California to apply what we had done within the university to the state as a whole. And it's to adopt the following language into the California Constitution. The state, that's a small s, which means that it applies to local government, special districts, public universities, state government. The state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public education, public employment, and public contracting. Now that means that where there's tax money involved, you're going to treat everybody the same. You're not going to make distinctions among them on the basis of those characteristics where there's tax money involved. That passed 55 to 45 in probably one of the bluest states on the planet. Then we went on to the state of Washington and presented that same initiative to the people of Washington, and it passed 59 to 41. Following that, the state of Michigan passed it 58 to 42. Following that, the state of Nebraska, 58 to 42. And then the state of Arizona, 60 to 40. We tried to get on the ballot here in your great state, but I'll tell you, if you don't know anything about citizen initiatives, There is no place on God's earth where it's more difficult to get on the ballot than the state of Oklahoma. Every roadblock that you can imagine is there to make sure that the people don't have any influence in the governing process. We even had the Service Employees International Union that would try to block us from pursuing someone or asking someone for their signature. And every roadblock that you can imagine was thrown in our way. Certain members of the legislature, however, felt that this was an idea whose time has come. And last year they placed it on the ballot for us. Senator Johnson and Representative Leslie Osborne, and the Speaker, the designated Speaker, T.W. Shannon, came to our rescue, and Nate here was the legislative advocate who shepherded it through the legislature. So now it's on the ballot. Question 759. The only difference between the language of 759 and the preceding 5 initiatives is that 759 begins with the phrase, "the state shall not grant preferential treatment to," rather than "the state shall not discriminate," because often we felt that people would kind of jump over the language and not realize that this is about stopping preferential treatment. And the fact that our organization is called the American Civil Rights Institute, some confuse that with their typical thinking of what civil rights is about. They believe in many instances that civil rights is just for black people. When I was on an MSNBC show that Reverend Al host, we got into a long argument about civil rights, and he asked the question, "Are you a believer in civil rights? Do you consider yourself a civil rights champion?" And I said yes. And he wanted to tell me that I really wasn't, because I didn't fit the mold of the 1960s types, and I believe that civil rights belongs to everybody. The right to free speech, freedom of speech, right to assembly, freedom of assembly, the right to equal treatment before the law. Those are civil rights that just aren't placed into the package of goodies that black people have. It belongs to everybody. And that's why we call ourselves the civil rights organization, much to the dismay of those that think otherwise. When I started getting involved in this effort, after the California initiative passed, I received a call from Newt Gingrich, who was the speaker at the time. And he said, "I want to help you." And I said, "Well, great." He said, "First of all, I think that you and I should write a joint op-ed and place it in various newspapers." I said, "That's a great idea. Let me take a first crack at it, send it off to you, and if you agree with it, then you go ahead and get it placed." We did that. And following that, he said, "What else can I do?" I said, "Well, I really would like not to spend my life going state to state on this. Could you get a bill passed, since you're the Speaker of the House, that would say that any agency that gets federal money shall abide by the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which the Congress has passed, a president signed. If they're going to get federal dollars, they need to abide by the laws that the Congress has put in place." He said, "That sounds like a great idea." And he said, "I want you to come back and meet with some of my members." So I flew back to D.C., and the first person with whom he wanted me to meet was J.C. Watts. Amen. And I walked into, he'd arranged the meetings for me, so I walked into Congressman Watts' office, and I'd never met him before. And he said, well, thank you for coming to meet with me. And I said, well, let me just spend a few minutes to explain to you what we're trying to do. He says, well, I think I know, but go right ahead. So I told him that I thought that the time had come for us to live by the language of the Civil Rights Act, which is that everybody should be treated as an equal when they apply for employment and public accommodations, and nobody should be discriminated against. By that time in American life, the phrase women and minorities was the way that our policies were crafted. Well, who's not included in that? White males. And I explained that to him and said that I don't think that's right. I think that that is a clear violation of equal treatment under the law. When I finished my eloquent comments, he said, I'm not with you. He said, we're not there yet. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, there is still racism in our country and in my state too. He said, the day that I was elected to the Congress, I got pulled over by an Oklahoma highway patrolman, state police, and he cited me for exceeding the speed limit. And he said, that's driving while black. He profiled me. And then he went on to say that my very best friend and I go to the same church. And my friend said to me that he would have some problems with my, I think he said, son marrying his daughter. He said, those two examples confirm to me that there is still racism. And I said, well, I don't know about that, but I do know that those two have nothing to do with preferences and hiring and contracting and admissions. He said, well, we'll just have to agree to disagree. So I walked out, went back to Newt's office, and I said, we don't have a deal. He's not supportive of that. And Newt said, well, JC is my go-to guy on this issue, and I'll have to do what he says. And I learned a lesson then about conservatism and how fleeting it can be with some who profess to be conservatives and believe in fundamental values, and how quickly they can cast those values aside. And I don't know how you feel about JC, that's not the point. The point is that this has been a very torturous and at sometimes lonely battle getting people to abide by the principle that there's probably nothing more fundamental than the relationship between a citizen and his or her government. If you pay your taxes and the government starts out treating you differently, that's no different from the circumstances that existed when I was a young man back in Leesville, Louisiana. If I couldn't trust my government to treat me as an equal, then I wasn't free. And that brings me right now to why I think that this battle needs to go on. We need to liberate black people and others from the legacy of thinking that they're wards of the state. There are a lot of reasons why we need to get rid of affirmative action, but one of them is to remove the training wheels that we still provide to black people, that society is going to harm you or give you benefits rather than presuming that you can cut it on your own. Tough love, if you want to call it that. But it's time to do it, folks. It's time to apply that so that people really know that we're not going to discriminate against you. We won't tolerate it. If I were to tell someone that I was speaking to this group, they would probably, many people would probably think that you're racist. Oklahoma is considered almost a racist state by many parts of America. You may not recognize that, but that is the reality of how some people perceive it. That has to be changed. The stereotype of black people has to be changed. We need to get fewer people of all colors in our prisons. We need to make sure that people take advantage of the educational opportunity that is provided. Not everybody has to go to college. But if we're going to provide the dollars, the hard-earned money for you to get a K through 12 education, doggone it, you better take advantage of it and use it to the fullest so that you can become a productive citizen of our society. And for those who are looking at 759, don't let white guilt influence you. This is the right thing to do because we're rebuilding American life around the building block of individual merit and the notion that everybody is going to paddle in this boat to carry their weight. So it's the right thing to do, and I strongly urge you to recognize the full parameters of this. This isn't just about getting rid of preferences. It's about rebuilding American life here in the great state of Oklahoma so that we're getting a full contribution, the fullest contribution that we possibly can from every resident of this great state. So with that, let me just thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. You must be getting tired sitting in those seats.
Thomas. Thomas Sowell mentioned that blacks had more upward mobility from the end of World War II to 1964 than from 1964 and Lyndon Johnson's civil rights movement to the present. It seems to be any time the government is trying to help someone, they ultimately hurt them.
I would agree with you. Tom is a good friend, prolific writer. He cranks out a book almost every day.
It's worth reading.
Yeah. He had just as an aside, he had the notion, probably 3 decades ago, that affirmative action, among its many problems, was what he called the mismatch theory. That the more select institutions were reaching down, taking black and Latino kids, putting them at the best institutions. They weren't matched up well with, their capabilities weren't matched up with the rest of the students at that college. They flunked out, dropped out, and that was a mismatch. That is now becoming mainstream thinking among a lot of people, but I think that there was more upward mobility back then than there is now. And I think that part of this is this mindset that we still lingers on women and minorities. Women have been able to escape that to a large extent. But the very term minorities suggests that someone is incapable of cutting it on their own. I always say that I'm a minority of one, and so is everybody else. I don't think that people get together and all whites have a meeting Monday morning everywhere in America and say, here's what we're going to do,
That's the president.
Yes, that. We're all the minority of one.
John.
This might be more of a question for our local shepherd of the state question, but could you address this exception number 3, where affirmative action will still be allowed when needed to keep or obtain federal money? How did we get stuck with that?
Well,
Now we're getting into our debate.
Turn down the money.
that has been in every initiative that we've had. It is not one that I prefer to have included, but it is one which I cowardly would I defend because it avoids a high-risk gamble. Let's say, for example, that the states, that we're going to challenge that. We're going to challenge the federal government. That is, in effect, the federal supremacy clause. Let's say that the state of Oklahoma had an initiative in its constitution which said that we're not going to allow affirmative action in our state at all. And the state was on the risk of losing $1 billion or so. In California, it's $15 billion. It's amazing how fast a lot of citizens, highly principled, will vote against something because they're going to lose $1 billion, tax dollars, for highway construction. We just prefer not to have that debate in the context of this issue, knowing that there is a federal supremacy clause. There's some who would say, let's have it, let's take it on, let's get on with the fight with the federal government. I don't know whether that's the majority view. And we would just prefer not to risk getting the fundamental principle in place, but then those institutions that you control here, also recognizing that the term affirmative action is in fact a rather amorphous one. It doesn't always mean preferential treatment. And to the extent that it doesn't, the federal government is simply saying you must have goals and timetables, even though I abhor that, and the courts have ruled that sometimes these goals and timetables are tantamount to quotas. But I would just prefer not to run the risk of having a political debate about an initiative with our opposition, the NAACP, the ACLU, and all the others, saying you're going to cause our state to lose $2 billion. And once that argument is out there, the whole thing shifts to how much, the debate shifts to how much we're going to be costing the taxpayers of this state. So it's a cowardly concession to the political realities.
Let me address that, please, for just a second here, a little bit further. John, there's political reality here. Unfortunately, with the quality of our state lawmakers that we have right now, they would have never put it on the ballot had you not had these exceptions in here. I don't like the exceptions. Ward doesn't like the exceptions, but they wouldn't put it on the ballot. And this is part of the problem. We need, why I say we need a better quality legislature. And also, many of the people here understand this. If Randy Brogdon had been elected governor as opposed to Mary Fallin, it would have been a different environment. Probably been quite willing to take on the federal government and challenge on some of these issues. But we couldn't get that done. By about 4.5 percentage points, there wasn't a runoff. And in that runoff, Randy Brogdon probably wins in that runoff. So there's a political reality. So if you can't get it on the ballot this way, you got to go back to the initiative petition. And you already spent, what, $250,000 trying to do that, and was unsuccessful in this state. So there's a difficulty to it. And one of the parts of the debate between Amanda and myself is the belief that this actually empowers the federal government. And the point I made is all it does is recognize the current level of the federal government. It doesn't empower it to go further than it is. And I think that's the mistake that Amanda is making on that.
Well, I think you're actually mistaken about that because you've got to keep or obtain. And the federal government's money is so far out of control and untrackable that they can argue they've got money anywhere. And they can make it look like they've got money somewhere and tell you what to do.
And Diane may want to address that here on that issue. I understand what you're saying. I don't agree with that. I think that's an overanalysis and a speculation on the thing myself.
And
but
in other
here's
words,
the
what
point.
department doesn't have federal money in?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that are funded by the state and not funded by the federal government. And like I say, Diane will address this in just a minute here. There are things that get federal money that don't require preferential hiring. Let me just go on to say, we need to understand something. Part of it is the supremacy clause. The supremacy clause actually refers to the 17 enumerated powers. And part of that is our job to educate our lawmakers that it doesn't apply outside of those 17. That's something that we need to do. Another thing too is we need to understand, folks, that virtually all the money we as taxpayers and our businesses and such as that in the state of Oklahoma send to Washington, virtually all of that money is consumed in 4 areas: highway funding, Social Security, Medicare, and defense spending. Virtually all other federal spending comes from China, borrowed money from China, or printed dollars. And a lot of people kind of shudder at the fact that, I don't want to lose federal dollars, but they've got to understand that's not their tax dollars they paid in. This is the deficit spending. And we've got to start rising up and saying no to this deficit spending. But how many of our lawmakers are willing to do that yet? And that's where we have got to challenge them and try to get them to think in those terms more. Can I let Diane speak to this first, and then I'll come to you. Diane?
Well, the federal funding, first of all, has been in all of the initiatives. It has not stopped any state from enforcing the initiative.
That's the practical reality.
That's the practical reality. It hasn't stopped it. There are some times when the federal government does have a requirement for an affirmative action program. It's most often in highway funding. That's where you'll see it most in the Department of Transportation. In fact, it says that only if you're going to lose your federal funding or to get it. Now, the federal government doesn't always, they've never taken away a dollar, ever. Even if an agency did not grant preference for hiring or contracting. Not $1 has ever been lost in any state, even one that has this initiative. And the only time we know of that it's even been threatened is the Obama administration threatened the Caltrans, our Department of Transportation, because we were not giving preferences to Hispanic contractors because they were overrepresented in the highway transportation contracting. And they said, no, you have to. Caltrans said, but our disparity study says they're overrepresented, and they said, no, you have to. They're part of the minorities, you have to. Otherwise, you might lose funding. It's never happened. No one's challenged it from the highway department. However, in California, it was in fact challenged by a local utility district. They said, oh, we get federal funding, therefore we must use preferences for hiring and contracting. That was challenged in court. And in court, the judge said, you're not losing anything. They didn't say they wouldn't give it to you unless you did that. That was never said. Therefore, you have absolutely no reason to be granting preferences because you have a state law that says you may not. And until and unless the federal government actually does something, you don't have to grant preferences. And so SMUD no longer uses race and gender preferences in their hiring and contracting. And so I see this, especially in Oklahoma, in a state where you have a lot more gumption here than we do in California, at least your state lawmakers do. You have a safe harbor that you can float there in that safe harbor and not lose your funding and say, we're not going to use preferences with our highway money. And if they challenge you, you can go to court and challenge that. So you have a safe harbor from which to lob big cannonballs at the feds without losing your funding. It just hasn't been a problem, except with the highway fund, so we got to go to Congress. That's what we're hoping for. A congressman who will put that bill in place to enforce the 1964 Civil Rights Act that says, without regard to race.
I don't understand that first exception, dealing with sex. I'm not the sharpest enough to
But bona fide sex,
Yeah, what's that?
locker rooms, bathrooms, strip searches in the prisons,
Oh,
locker rooms. You want your kids to have co-ed locker rooms at high school?
Okay.
Probably not.
we should give an example. I didn't understand that.
Okay,
Other questions?
Yes, Steve.
Just a very good note. I talked to Speaker Shannon at one point about his plan to plan for what happens when we don't get federal funds anymore. He actually is working on that, our incoming speaker. What will the state of Oklahoma do when federal funds start getting cut? Not because of this, but because of the overall state of the federal budget and the massive money printing. So I think that's a very good thing for our state, that our speaker is actually even looking at that. I've never heard of anybody doing that. So good job to the speaker.
To summarize this point, though, this does not give the federal government one iota of extra power at all. We can't give the federal government anything. So just, we can't control that. But is it better for the state to at least geld this process wherever it can, rather than to do nothing and just let things build as they will? And I think if you really think it through, you will conclude this is a preferred path.
I think too often conservatives have an all or nothing mentality.
Yeah.
And we need to realize that liberals have gotten their agenda forward in many areas through incrementally doing.
That's right.
And we need to understand as well, an all or nothing attitude is just going to put us in the corner, and we're just going to get slammed.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Okay, anyone else?
Well, thank you very much for giving me your ear.
Thank you.
I actually was going to have you vote on this today to see if we would endorse this, but I didn't get the ballots out in time. There's going to be some other issue we're going to be voting on, so we'll just wait on that to a later date. I want to urge folks, if you want to check out the items on this table, do so as quickly as possible. My wife and I are leaving for Midland, Texas. I'll be speaking down there twice tomorrow, and so I need to get out of here as soon as possible. So,
Do you have a
thank you.
bodyguard?
Pardon me?
Do you have a bodyguard?
Not that I know of. My wife. Yeah. But if you think that is some trouble, just go over and talk to her. Okay? Thank you so much for coming today, and we look forward to, we're going to have Brandon Dutcher here next week, and they have produced a film on education. I think you'll find it to be very interesting, so we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.